North Korea has one powerful ally, and it is China. If any country can influence North Korean leader Kim Jong-un, again, it is China. Our resolution for this round: the U.S. and China can forge a grand bargain to contain North Korea. Our first debater on this, Noah Feldman, do you declare yes or no?
I'm going to say no. I don't think that, in the end, there's a picture of Chinese national interest in which steps would be taken that would put North Korea in a situation where it was actually vulnerable to regime collapse. Now, containment it's a tricky word, and so if the resolution were to be interpreted to say, well, to hold North Korea back from using nuclear weapons, I would be inclined to say yes. But containment suggests something other than that. Containment suggests non-expansion, and I think for the moment, the risks to China of South Korea and North Korea potentially unifying in a way that leaves a hostile power on its border is so great that China will have to keep North Korea in place. And to keep North Korea in place at this point seems to require accepting its nuclear program at least as strongly as it presently is. So I don't see a containment strategy in that sense.
David Chambaugh, again, this resolution, the U.S. and China can forge a grand bargain to contain North Korea. Are you yes or no?
I'm tempted to leave my marker like that because I'm ambivalent about the answer.
You want to be a maybe on this?
I was going to be a no, but I'm actually going to change my vote and be a little provocative and vote yes. The problem...
We appreciate that since you voted no. This is a debate.
We all know this is a real conundrum. There are no good resolutions or solutions, or they would have been used and discovered already on North Korea. But what we haven't talked about with the Chinese, as far as I know, is a post-unification scenario. If we can persuade the Chinese about a unified Korean peninsula with essentially a South Korean regime that does not have American forces on it and does not necessarily have an American alliance with it, that would alleviate their neuralgic national security concerns considerably. They can't stand the North Korean regime. They've had problems with the North Korean regime since June 1950 when the North attacked the South and they didn't know. It's been 50 years of hell for the Chinese with North Korea. They don't like the regime, so we have to bring them somehow to a regime transition perspective together.
Thank you. Time is up on that. And now, Ian Bremmer, the motion, the resolution, the U.S. and China can forge a grand bargain to contain North Korea. Are you yes or no, Ian Bremmer?
I'm going to say no, in large part because I want to be with Noah on one of these. And I think that's true. Look, I think containing implies that we can keep them sort of where they are. And, you know, I look at what the North Koreans are now doing on cyber. Right, the WannaCry virus hit not just the U.S., but actually hit the Chinese harder. The attacks against the central bank in Bangladesh, the SWIFT codes. I don't see anything that looks like containment there. And the fact that we're talking about nukes and ICBMs in the United States and not talking about cyber from North Korea doesn't mean that this isn't a very serious problem. I agree completely with David that the North Koreans are a very serious problem for China, but also the Chinese themselves seem to be losing influence. Remember, he had the half-brother assassinated while he was under Chinese protection. I just don't think the Chinese believe they can do it, so they won't try.
Thank you, Ian Bremmer. Liz Economy, once again stating the resolution, the U.S. and China can forge a grand bargain to contain North Korea. Do you declare yes or no?
So, yes. In the immortal words of Bob the Builder, can we fix it? Yes, we can. So I think China and the U.S. are closer to being able to forge an agreement on North Korea than at any time in the past decade. In part, I think it's because Kim Jong-un has changed the facts on the ground, now can launch a missile strike and perhaps a nuclear warhead in the near future that can hit the United States. And that's changed the calculus here, and the Chinese understand that. In part, it's because we have a new president for whom conventional wisdom and historical knowledge do not pose any restrictions. And also, he wants all options on the table and wants an agreement, wants to make a deal. And in part, it's because, as I mentioned earlier, the Chinese leadership itself is under enormous pressure. The foreign policy elite want the government to take a tougher line. The Chinese public are concerned about things like nuclear radioactive fallout. And there's a fear that President Trump might go rogue and leave China to pick up the pieces. So what an agreement might look like is a different issue, but can we fix it? Yes, we can.
Thank you, Liz Economy. So let me take this first to Noah Feldman. You know, we've just come through a period where the United Nations Security Council passed, for the 9th time since 2006, they've passed sanctions against North Korea. The U.S. wanted some very, very tough sanctions. They wanted to freeze the leader's international assets. They wanted to stop all imports of petroleum products. They didn't get that because China and Russia insisted on making it softer. What's the implication of that action by China and Russia? But right now, let's make it China in terms of this question of being able to forge a grand bargain.
To me, the implication is that China was willing to do the initial round of sanctions just thus far and no further. They're not willing to undertake steps that might actually put sufficient pressure on North Korea to make the regime totter. And that's, I think, a very significant moment for them. It's their way of saying that, yes, we're annoyed with the North Koreans, maybe more than annoyed. Yes, we're worried. Yes, we don't want regional destabilization. But we actually aren't prepared to do anything about it because fixing the problem would require steps that contradict our national interest. And you know, we have allies like that too, not to put too fine a point on it, where we might want them to do things that we would be able to, you'd think, given our level of support and commitment, require them or obligate them to do. And sometimes those allies say to us, no. You know, what's your point of leverage against us? And I think this is exactly what's happening to the Chinese in North Korea.
David Shambaugh, you're arguing that the bargain is doable. You're changing your mind now?
Well, the problem is the North Koreans won't go peacefully into the night. You know, so even if the Americans and the Chinese could come, and the South Koreans and Japan and the other actors could come to agreement about regime transition, the North Koreans aren't going to go along with it. So that brings us back to square one, or intelligence squared, with containment and sanctions and pressure.
We love that cross-promotion, thank you.
But I'm just trying to put on the table that we haven't at least had the conversation with the Chinese whereby they could be a post-unification Korea that was not threatening to China. That's what they worry about. They don't want regime collapse, A, because of the humanitarian dimension, B, the economic dimension, having picked up the pieces. It cost 12 times, apparently, the amount of money to rebuild the North as it did West Germany to absorb the former East Germany. They don't, obviously want a communist state on their periphery, one of the 4 remaining communist states on the planet, to go down. So, but if there are ways to sort of figure out some broader transition and a coalition government or a phased transition between North and South, we haven't had these conversations.
All right, let's bring in Liz Economy. You're also a yes on this.
Yeah, David is absolutely right, and it's interesting that a noted Chinese scholar, who's a friend of both ours, has just published an article talking about the need for China to have this kind of contingency planning take place, Jia Qingguo. So it's an example of how, yes, the Chinese went so far and not that far with this set of negotiations, but this far is further than they went in the last round of sanctions. So you see the Chinese progressing over time in terms of the severity of the sanctions that they're willing to implement on North Korea. Let's not forget that in 5 years of Xi Jinping's presidency, he has not met once with Kim Jong-un. There is no love lost between this Chinese leader and Kim Jong-un. And while it's true that, it's not clear that Kim Jong-un will go peacefully into the night, there are other options, right? There's the decapitation option. And I'm not suggesting that China's there yet, but it took a long time for the United States.
Could you de-euphemize that word, decapitation?
Decapitation. I was hoping not to.
Literally, it was not a euphemism at all.
It kind of was. It kind of was. Thank you. Yeah, so it would mean the elimination of Kim Jong-un, or perhaps we just send him to Switzerland with $1 billion, and that would be a better way to go. But I do think that the Chinese are increasingly open to tougher actions against North Korea for their own reasons.
Ian Bremmer, to respond?
I think the Rodman plan is as likely to work as what we just heard.
Hey, wait a minute. Ping-pong diplomacy goes to basketball diplomacy. Don't laugh.
Look,
it's real.
If you want to go there, feel free. I don't think that's your yes vote. But my no vote is the fact that the North Koreans understand that Gaddafi didn't have nukes, dead. Hussein, no nukes, dead. Kim Jong-un, not dead. And, I look at what's in front of them. I see a guy that wants to develop an ICBM with re-entry capabilities, wants to develop a miniaturized set of nuclear warheads, wants to be in a position where truly the decapitation option is truly not on the table, and then we can do a deal. Now, that's after containment. In other words, that's containing from a bigger place. America has history with that. We told the Indians and Pakistanis, no nukes. You do nukes, we're going to have a problem with you. They do the nukes, they do the tests, we sanction them. We put serious sanctions. After, 10 plus years, we pull the sanctions back. Why? Because they behaved? No, because they didn't. They broke through the containment. We're like, well, shit, we lost on that one, so I guess we got to deal with you guys now.
Wait, did you just use profanity?
No.
Oh.
So,
Good.
So this is after-hours HBO-like stuff, right? So my point is that there is absolutely, I can see into the future, once the North Koreans develop a nuclear program that they consider is sufficiently robust to avoid the decapitation, we could absolutely, with the Chinese, get to a deal. We are not there yet.
David Shumba. I'll come to you after.
War is not an option. Some sort of discussions need to take place directly with the North, multi-party discussions. And again, I come back to the sort of unification dimension of all this. That's the one thing all parties agree on. North wants to unify, South wants to unify. The Americans are not opposed to it, the Chinese are not opposed to it. I think we need to kind of think beyond nukes, first of all. That's the American obsession. And for good reason. That's not the Chinese obsession. So there's a different set, they're kind of apples and oranges and two ships sort of passing in the night, and they're not really talking beyond the immediate.
Noah Feldman?
I just wanted to point out directly in response to David's really important point that there's a structural problem with a demilitarized, unified Korea that the US wouldn't be defending, and that is China, right? So whatever this entity would be, for South Korea to agree to enter it, no matter how idealistic they might be feeling that day, they're going to be aware that their entity will now be bordering China directly, and they will need a security guarantor, and that's only us. There isn't another credible, and no degree of self-protection is going to suffice against China. So to me, there's a structural problem with even beginning to imagine what I think you said, quasi-demilitarized, unified Korea would look like.
You're assuming that South Korea would not want to live in a Chinese sphere of influence.
No, I think they fully accept living in a Chinese sphere of influence.
They would.
I think they're already in a Chinese sphere of influence in economic terms. I think what they have wanted thus far, and to my mind this is the current conundrum of the Pacific generally, countries are living under the Chinese economic sphere of influence while depending on the US as a security guarantor. They're playing both ends against the middle, and that has worked for those countries.
Liz Economy, you're again arguing, yes, you think that a grand bargain can be forged to contain North Korea. What does this bargain look like in such a way that Kim Jong-un would actually be willing to comply with it?
Well, first of all, I'm not sure there is a bargain that Kim Jong-un is willing to comply with. But I do think that we have to...
That's back to decapitation.
Right, that's back to decapitation. But I do think...
So is that the grand bargain for containment?
It may well be.
Clever redefinition.
Nobody limited the sort of scope of options moving forward. So, no, I think, look, the Chinese have put on the table the freeze and freeze. It doesn't seem as though the North Koreans have even picked up on that yet, right? So Kim Jong-un would freeze sort of the development of nuclear weapons, and we would not have any more military exercises with South Korea for the time being. I think David's right. We have to get back to the table. You may laugh at the idea of basketball diplomacy, but actually, that is what broke through with the Chinese, right? The ping-pong diplomacy was the first thing. Maybe we have a round-robin tournament with North Korea, China, the United States, and South Korea. And we begin to break the ice. And then we go into more formal talks with North Korea. So, and then we move into, United States, form some sort of peace treaty, right? And then we move to the United States establishing a representative office. I mean, there are many, one of the interesting things about this conundrum is that there are so many different elements to it. There are so many different things that could come into play. And I think we're finally at a point where the Chinese are actually desiring to do something.
And that concludes debate on this resolution.